Welcome back to the channel. Today we are repainting these faded doors. Here is the current paint on the doors on the exterior of my house. As you can see, the color is, first of all, a terrible color. It's extremely sun-faded. You can see it's chipped and blistering in a number of areas, and the hardware itself is also not in the best condition at this point. So this is a good, relatively quick, and relatively inexpensive project to make the house look a lot better from the outside and look a lot more fresh. The reason I decided to do this now was that I had to pull off a bunch of my locks anyway because I wanted to rekey my entire house, so it makes sense to do everything now when it's already torn apart. To begin, I opened the door, then I used a punch to remove the pins from the hinges. With the door pulled off of the hinges, we're going to start removing any hardware that's on the door that you don't want to cover in paint. This includes the curtain that you see here on the back, as well as the little mounting tabs for it. I'm going to remove the plates for the hinges on the inside of the door, and then finally I'm going to remove the lock in the door handle. At this point, you're going to bring the door to your working area. For me, that's just this room because I'm a little bit space limited. But what I would recommend doing for most people is put down a layer of cardboard or something to protect your floors, so that way if you slide the door around, you don't damage or scratch them up. We're going to start by preparing the surface to be painted. On this door specifically, the outside paint was faded, but it wasn't cracked, chipped, or peeling in any places. I did a light sanding of the door while it was still on the frame, and now I'm just washing all that dust off, but if the paint is not in good condition, what you'll have to do is scrape off or sand off all of that loose debris, thereby giving you a nice clean mounting surface for the next layer of paint that you're going to apply. For a point of reference, here's a few other doors in my house that I also repainted later on. You can see that I had to strip or sand away a significant amount of paint before applying the new coat, because anything that you can see now, that is any cracks, any divots, any chips, anywhere that the level of that surface changes is still going to be visible through the next coat of paint. What I'm saying is that painted surface is not going to look any better or any more consistent than the surface below it, so really focus on what you're doing to prep. That said, with whatever prep work you do as far as scraping or sanding, just make sure you give it a good wash before you put the paint on, otherwise it could create adhesion issues. After giving this door a good scrub, I'm now masking off the area to not get paint on the surrounding surfaces and to try to keep my floors clean. If you lay the door down on a sheet of cardboard, that is perfectly fine for catching any paint. What I'm using here are trash bags that are cut in half because this plastic layer does not let paint go through it. You'll also notice that I'm making sure that it covers below that hole where the door handle goes in. Something could drip through that, and that is an area that people tend to miss. Then you're ready to thoroughly mix and start applying your paint. And this should go without saying, but make sure the door is completely dry before you start painting it. I'm just applying it with a 3-inch roller here, and the paint that I'm using is actually a primer and paint in one. If you don't have a 2-in-1, you might need to do a primer first, depending on the paint that you're using. This is pretty simple though. You want the roller to be semi-saturated but not absolutely dripping, and then you're just rolling it over the surface and spreading out the paint to get a nice even coating without any runs, any puddles, or any spots that are oversaturated that might give you a weird texture. You'll see that I'm getting a lot of the fine details, such as the trim around that window and around those two little rectangular panels in the lower part, using a paintbrush to really push the paint down and into the cracks. You can try to use the tip of the roller for some of the curved surfaces, but the reality is it's just not small enough to get down into those really fine spaces, so even if you're rolling the majority of the surface, you will need a paintbrush to get into those areas. Something else you might notice is that I did not mask off the window even though I'm painting right up against it. You'll see why I didn't do this towards the end of the video, but we are going to go back and clean up those lines so that we don't have massive overruns onto that window pane. In total, I applied 3 coats of paint to this door, and I waited about 15 to 20 minutes between coats to allow the prior coat to dry. And what I highly recommend, and what you'll see me doing now after putting on that last coat, is changing out the hinges on your door as well. This is a small detail that's relatively inexpensive, but it does make a massive difference to the final product. A new set of hinges is something like $7, and my old ones were extremely rusty. I'm just putting the new hinges into the locations that are already cut for the old ones. I measured to make sure I was getting hinges that were the same size so that everything would line up properly, and after the paints had sufficient time to dry on the door itself, I can go back and install the other half of the hinges on the door. But before we install those, I'm going to clean up that window that I didn't mask off earlier. I'm doing this part about 20 to 30 minutes after I applied that final coat, before the paint is fully dried and fully cured. cured. Basically, just don't leave this for a day or two or else the paint might be too dry to do this easily. I'm taking a utility knife and I'm just tracing a line starting at the corner so I get a nice sharp corner coming out towards the center, and I'm just making a straight line along where I want the paint to end. By doing this, I'm giving the cured paint a place to break. Next, I'm going to come in with this scraper blade, which is just a flat razor blade, and we're going to scrape up that excess paint up to that line that we just cut. You can see here that the chunks are coming up in this big string, and that's what you want to see. If it's not doing that, chances are you haven't given it enough time to dry. Once I'm satisfied with this, I go ahead and clean up all of that paint that we just removed. Then I put the hinges on the outside of the door. I didn't want to do this while it was still on the ground because it might have dug into the floor below it. Then it's just the reverse process of how we took the door off in the first place. One thing I do want to note is one of the hinges was slightly misaligned now that I've replaced them. So what I ended up doing is just going back to the screws on the door frame, loosening them ever so slightly that they could shift just a little bit. Then I put the door back in place, put the pins back in the hinges, then retighten those screws. This gave me a perfect alignment, and this was a couple years ago at this point that I installed it. To this day, I have not had a single issue with that alignment. You can also reinstall the rest of your hardware at this point. One thing I want to note here is I ended up reusing the old hardware because my new locks had not been delivered yet. If you were doing that, don't install them as tightly as you might want to. There's a chance that the paint will adhere to that hardware and it might start to peel up when you remove that hardware to install the new stuff later on. But other than that, including the downtime, this project was completed within the course of a single afternoon. I get this color isn't for everyone, and as you'll see in the future, I'm already planning to do some other stuff to the exterior of my house, which is why I selected this color ahead of time. But even so, I think this already looks so much better than the sun-faded salmon from the 80s. Hopefully this inspires you to tackle some projects on your own, but that'll do it for this episode. I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.